Hey there, time travelers! Ready for another nostalgia trip back to the past? Hop in, because in today's video, we're traveling back to a time when catching them all referred to one of two things. There was Pokemon, and there was Danny Phantom, who had to stop all of the ghosts that were coming through. Danny Phantom was hands down one of the best and most beloved Nickelodeon shows. Not only did it have an amazing premise, but every character that was introduced to us had a deep and impactful backstory. One thing that we noticed going back in and rewatching the shows as adults, however, is that Danny Phantom was a dark show for children. Today, we're talking about the things you never noticed in Danny Phantom when we watched it as children. Be sure to stick around until the end of the video for a fun bonus theory about who Danny Phantom grew up to become. For a cartoon that was originally aimed toward a younger audience, Danny Phantom always did a good job glossing over one of the darkest aspects of the show, and that's the fact that almost all of the antagonists and some of the protagonists of the series are dead. And I know that should be pretty obvious considering Danny Phantom is a show about a half-ghost protecting his loved ones from ghosts that continue to leak into the world of the living, but throughout the series, they never really discuss how much these young teenagers are dealing with death. It's literally all around them. And when you take a closer look at all of the ghosts that Danny and the gang end up interacting with, you might notice that each and every one of them was designed in a way that tells us how they died and became such vengeful ghosts in the first place. And remember, this pertains to Danny as well. Though his ghostly powers seem really cool, you need to remember that the young boy is actually dead, and his body just so happens to be possessed by his own ghost. But we'll get into Danny's situation more in a minute. First, let's take a look at some of his bigger nemesis. Ember McLean made her first appearance in the first season of Danny Phantom and was responsible for creating the hypnotically catchy song Remember, which many fans believe to be a song based on her life and death before becoming the ghostly villainess. Ember appeared as a pale white, rocker-looking teenage ghost who was clearly going through her rebellious phase, and anytime she showed up, one of the most noticeable details about Ember's character design was her blue, flame-like hair, which led many fans to believe that her death somehow involved a fire. Well, it turns out that one of the show's directors has confirmed this theory. According to them, in Ember's previous life, she was a rock star, but instead she was an unpopular high school girl who spent most of her time dreaming about one day making it as a true rock star. Well, one day, the boy that she liked asked her out on a date to the movies. She waited all night for the boy to pick her up and take her to the movies for their date, but he never showed up. Ember had stayed up all night trying to convince herself that he had just been running late, but eventually she gave up on waiting for the boy and went home. In her exhausted state, Ember fell into a deep sleep and was unable to wake up when the house that she was sleeping in caught fire around her. She died surrounded by flames, alone. As for Johnny 13, another iconic antagonist for Danny and his friends, his backstory is even more obvious, but equally as tragic. Johnny first appeared in the Season 1 episode titled 13, and he is known as one of the few villains in the series who isn't particularly sinister. Instead, Johnny is the type of ghost that simply enjoys spreading mild havoc around, and when it comes to facing off with Danny, it almost appeared like Johnny was more messing around with him rather than trying to destroy him, like some of Danny's other enemies. Johnny 13 is most well known for the motorcycle that he rides around on, as well as his shadow, that has the ability to separate itself from Johnny and wreak havoc on its own. When it comes to Johnny's death, we have to look at two aspects of his character. The first being the fact that he is known to have bad luck, and he uses his shadow to spread that bad luck to others. The next thing we need to look at is his outfit and personality. It's clear that Johnny is based on a typical 1950s biker character, and he doesn't appear to be too fond of wearing a helmet. And when you put the two together, it becomes rather clear that in his previous life, Johnny most likely died in a tragic motorcycle accident. And to make things worse, there's a good chance that his girlfriend Kitty also lost her life in that same accident. Another ghost that Danny had to face off against that, rather than simply wanting to hurt him, preferred to mess with him and make him look crazy, was Youngblood. Youngblood was the ghost of a child who was unsurprisingly childish, though he did his best to act more intelligent than he actually was. He clearly enjoyed playing make-believe, considering he most likely wasn't a pirate in his past life, and lucky for him, he had an assistant ghost that tended to go along with Youngblood's imagination and shapeshift into various animals to go along with the child's pranks and games. He was a parrot when Youngblood was acting as a pirate, and then came back as a horse when Youngblood was pretending to be a cowboy later in the show. Now, it's obvious why Youngblood's death is a sad one, considering the fact that he was a child. Judging by the way that he acts, he was likely no older than 5 at the time of his death, which led many fans to believe that he had some sort of terminal illness that presented itself at birth. Youngblood likely spent most of his previous life in the hospital, doing everything that he could to pretend that he was alright, and instead of being sick, he would likely imagine himself as a pirate on a grand adventure. Sadly, he clearly succumbed to his illness and crossed over to the ghost zone. Next up, let's take a look at one of Danny's biggest enemies, Skulker. Skulker is shown to be a hunter in every aspect of the noun. He's a ghost who spends his time tracking and hunting down other ghosts and unique artifacts. And once he hears about a half-ghost boy, he began to target Danny. It was eventually revealed to us that Skulker was just a blob-like ghost who is wearing a suit of armor that is tailor-made for his career as a hunter. Judging by his design and the character's affinity for hunting, many fans have theorized that Skulker most likely died in some sort of terrible hunting accident. Many believe that he might have even been brutally taken out by whatever animal he had been attempting to hunt at the time and eventually torn to pieces. And that's why the blob-like ghost that is Skulker doesn't have a humanoid form, because it had been torn to shreds and most likely eaten by whatever animal or animals he had been hunting. His ghost then went on to design the armor that he wears, which he designed to look how he had always wanted to look in real life: menacing. Another villain who ended up developing a very personal grudge against Danny was the ghostly prison warden named Walker. Walker is introduced as the warden of a prison located within the Ghost Zone, where he took charge of criminals of all shapes and sizes. Walker ended up building a grudge against Danny after discovering him in the Ghost Zone, and though he let Danny off with a warning, when he saw him next, Walker promptly arrested Danny and imprisoned him. This ended up leading to Danny breaking out of the Ghost Zone prison and essentially painting a massive target on his back for Walker. Now, as a child, I couldn't help but wonder how Walker would have ended up in the position of becoming a prison warden in the Ghost Zone. But then it hit me. He was most likely a warden in real life, a job that he obviously took very seriously, and a job that most likely got him killed. Many fans of the show believe that Walker was murdered during a prison riot that took place in the human world. Because it seems like the ghosts carry their career over into the afterlife, Walker became the biggest and baddest warden in the Ghost Zone. The last person to talk about before getting into our special bonus theory is the man himself, Danny Fenton. Arguably one of the most heroic characters to come out of Nickelodeon, Danny doesn't have your typical hero's journey. Instead, he has something much darker. Growing up in a home raised by parents whose relationship with ghosts couldn't be described as anything other than an obsession. Despite their quirkiness, Danny loved his parents and would do anything he could to keep them safe. Danny grew up hoping to become an astronaut, but sadly following an accident in his parents' lab, he wouldn't be growing up anymore. That's because despite what many people might think, he wasn't a half-ghost, half-human. Instead, he was dead. Danny was a teenager who got electrocuted when he attempted to check out his parents' latest invention, the ghost portal. The electric shock killed him and his ghost left his body. However, due to his body's position between the Ghost Zone and the human world, his ghost was able to travel back in time and repossess his own body, thus giving Danny the appearance of life, but the ability to transform into his ghost form whenever necessary. In other words, Danny is nothing more than a dead 14-year-old boy whose body is possessed by his own ghost. He then has to figure out how to navigate his life and keep his identity as a ghost boy secret. And here's the twist: unlike most heroes who choose to keep their identities hidden to protect their loved ones, Danny had to keep his identity hidden to protect himself from his family. And despite living in a state of constant fear that his ghost hunting parents will find out what he was and become a target, he still did everything that he could to protect his mother and father. Danny Fenton, in my opinion, is one of the most interesting characters to come out of any cartoon. And in his series, he was a hero through and through. It's just sad to think that in order to become a hero, he had to literally die. It's not all sad though. As an added bonus theory, it looks like Danny might end up growing up to lead a very full life. You see, there's a select handful of fans that could not help but see the similarities between Danny's character design and the design of hip-hop sensation Chip Skylark. And though we never hear Danny talk about his obsession with shiny teeth, it's hard to ignore the similarities between the two characters. Aside from the noticeable age difference, Danny and Chip both have the same color and similar styles of hair. On top of that, if you take a look at their eyes, they're almost the exact same shade of dark blue. And though we never see Chip talking about ghosts, that doesn't mean Danny isn't still using a secret identity of sorts to keep himself and those around him safe. Another thing to point out is that Chip Skylark, along with shiny teeth, has a goatee. This is interesting to me because in Danny Phantom Season 2, Episodes 8 and 9, we actually got to meet a version of Danny from an alternate future. In this timeline, Danny had turned to the dark side, became evil, much like Glad Plasmius. But take a look at future Danny's particular choice of facial hair. That's right, he had a goatee just like Chip does. I'm not saying that it's not a stretch, but I can see why some people think that Danny would grow up to become Chip Skylark. Personally, I don't think that this was the case. It just doesn't fit Danny's character, especially since Danny has an obsession with space rather than wanting to become a vocalist. But that being said, anything can happen, and should Butch Harmon come out and say that Danny did, in fact, grow up to become Chip Skylark, it wouldn't be super hard to believe. Danny Phantom has always been one of my favorite shows, and rewatching it never gets old. But I'm curious, when you were younger, did you ever notice how tragic the show was, especially with all of the ghosts and their backstories? Also, which of Danny's ghostly enemies did you feel the sorriest for when you realized how they died? Be sure to let us know in the comments below. We love to hear from you all. That's all for today. Remember, if you enjoyed today's nostalgic video, be sure to like and subscribe to make sure you don't miss the chance to travel back through time.